Before we start getting more advanced, I just want to recap now in a bit more detail each of the 3 methods we just discussed on how to add event listeners to an element. And the very first one we discussed was this inline event listener. And as you know, this is the easiest way. It's the most straightforward way to begin understanding events. But as you'll see shortly, they generally shouldn't be used beyond testing and educational purposes. But it's a good place to start, and that's why we looked at it. And do you remember the syntax? Do you remember how to do it? Well, let's just call up this example here of a button. This is our HTML, and we know that an inline event listener is a bit more messy. It's not just straight HTML like this, is it? We have to add an attribute. We have to add a property to this button. And in this example, let's say we want to listen out for the click event. How would we do it? Well, as I'm sure you guessed, and as you remember, we have to add this property value called onClick to this button. And as I mentioned, this onClick is a DOM API keyword. We have to use this specific spelling and this word. If we misspell it, it won't work. So we add this attribute to the button. Then what do? Well, then we have to assign it a value, don't we? And we do that with the equal sign. And the last thing we have to do is we have to define the function that gets called whenever this onClick event gets fired. And in our example, we defined a function called boom, and we had that function defined in a separate script. But we don't have to have a script. In fact, we can write our JavaScript directly inline as well. For example, let's just alert hi to the screen. So there we have it. We have a valid inline event listener on the screen right now. And as you can see, it's kind of intuitive and it kind of makes sense. We know that that alert function will get executed automatically every time a click event is fired on that button. To recap, we are writing our click listener, aka onClick, and in this case we're also writing our handler, aka that alert function, inline within our HTML file. All is good and well, but this method is not great. Well, why is it not great? As I said, it might seem easy to use an event handler attribute if you're just doing something really quick, but it can quickly become unmanageable, inefficient, and not search engine friendly. Generally, it is not a good idea to mix up your HTML and your JavaScript, as it becomes hard to parse. Keeping your JavaScript all in one place is a far better approach. And if it's in a separate file, you can apply it to multiple HTML documents. Even in a single file, inline event handlers are not a good idea. For example, one button would be okay. But what happens if you had 100 buttons? You'd have to add 100 attributes to a file. It would quickly turn into a maintenance nightmare. And just in case you're not sick of my voice yet, I just want to drive this point home one more time. You can compare an inline event listener to writing inline CSS on an HTML element. It's just not a great idea. It's much more practical to maintain a separate style sheet of classes than create inline styles on every element in your page. And similarly, it's just more feasible to maintain our JavaScript in an entirely separate script file than adding JavaScript event handlers and listeners to every element in our HTML inline. It just doesn't make sense. Have you got it now? I'm sure you have. But anyway, before we move on to discussing the next method, I want us to now look at a practical, cool, fun example of using an inline event listener. And I know it's not the best practice, but trust me, learning these basics and nailing these points home now will help you going forward. So I'll see you in the next lecture. Let's have fun. Get your computer out. Get ready to code along with me. See you now.